Hey everyone, Dom here. In this snippet, we are going to talk about JSON and implementing JSON.stringify. I like this question because not only is it JavaScript related, but it's also a good algorithm question. So before we dive deeper, let's go ahead and get more context about JSON. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It's a format that represents data based on the JavaScript object syntax. Even though its format resembles JavaScript objects, it doesn't mean that it can only be used in JavaScript. In fact, pretty much every language has a way to parse, create, and read JSON. The most common use case of JSON is transmitting data through the network, like sending data from client to server and vice versa. JavaScript provides the global JSON object to help us serialize and deserialize data. JSON.parse converts a JSON string into a JavaScript object, while JSON.stringify converts a JavaScript object into a JSON string. Let's go over a simple example of this use case. Let's say we want to create a YouTube account, so we are in the register page. The user will fill up a form, and in the end, we will have data similar to this that we want to send to the server. Here we can see different types of values. We have strings for username and password, number for age, Boolean for is premium, which means you want to sign up for premium account, and an array of notifications for the ones that you want to receive. In this case, it's subscriptions and likes to your channel. Let's see what this looks like when you log this data in the console. We see that it's very similar to the code that we have here, the keys on the left and the values on the right. Now, before we have to send this to the server, we have to convert this object into a string. That's where JSON.stringify function comes in. So if I uncomment this, let's look at what this looks like in the console on the right. I'm going to clear this and refresh. Here, we can see the string representation of the data that we want to send to the server. All the keys are surrounded by double quotes. String values are also surrounded by double quotes, while the Boolean right here and the number are not surrounded by double quotes. Then we can see that the array is surrounded by brackets and the whole object obviously is surrounded by the curly braces. Now let's convert that back to a JavaScript object by calling JSON.parse. And we will see that it's the same as before. So I'm just going to clear that again. And as you can see here, after converting it to a string, it looks like this. And after converting this string back to an object, it looks like this. And this is very similar to our data being logged right here. One last thing, let's look at some other important notes about the JSON structure. JSON is purely a string with a specified data format. It contains only properties and no methods. JSON requires double quotes to be used around strings and property names. Single quotes are not valid. If you misplace a comma or a colon, then the JSON will not be valid. But for our purposes, we are only going to work with valid JSON to make our function simpler to implement. JSON can actually take the form of any data type that is valid for inclusion inside JSON. So not just arrays or objects. For example, a single string or number would be valid JSON. And unlike in JavaScript code, in which object properties may be uncoded, in JSON, only coded strings may be used as properties. All right, so now that we've laid the ground rules, let's move on into trying to implement our own stringify function. Let's implement a simple JSON.stringify function. I have here the links to the documentation we were looking at, and also a link to the documentation of JSON.stringify function. What we're going to do is create a function that returns a string, which represents the JSON structure of a given JavaScript object. Here are the values we expect to get: strings, Boolean, number, arrays, and object. So what I have down here are the test cases that we can run to try and see what the behavior is of the actual JSON.stringify. So what we can imitate that and make sure that whenever we run our functions, they're the same as the real JSON.stringify function. Let's pull up the console here to see what is currently being printed. For the calls to stringify, it returns false because we've not implemented it yet, and those are the ones on the left side. Calls to JSON.stringify are on the right side. Things to notice are objects are enclosed in curly braces, arrays are enclosed in brackets, the object keys are enclosed in double quotes, as well as strings like hello here and the letter A here. Numbers are not enclosed in double quotes for 21, 2, and Booleans are also not enclosed in double quotes, like false and true over here. Another thing to notice is that for test 4 and test 5, we didn't even pass an object or an array. We just passed single values, primitive values like number and string. And so this is how they will print out when JSON.stringify is called on those single values. And that's the thing to note here, because we saw this earlier in the documentation, how these are valid JSON. And this will actually be important when we start implementing our stringify function. Let's start implementing a stringify function by having a pseudocode or skeleton that helps us guide through every single case that we have to handle. What I'm going to do for this implementation is I'm going to copy over snippets of code and explain what they mean line by line to make things easier. So the first thing I'm going to do is copy over the skeleton code or comments that I've created beforehand that tackles every single case that we have to think about. So for the first thing is handling strings. We know that we have to enclose those in double quotes. Handling numbers and booleans, we just basically return the string and representation of those values. Handling arrays, we have to loop over every single element of that array. And then handling object, we have to loop over all the keys and values. So let's start and begin with a string. I'm going to copy over the first piece of code, which is an if condition that checks if object right here is of type string. If it is, we basically just return that object and close in double quotes. That's simple enough, right? Okay, for the next one, we need to think about numbers and booleans. So there's not really much different for this one. Basically, we just do the same if check. If the object is a number or object is a boolean, then we return object by itself without enclosing it in double quotes. But basically this converts it to a string. Okay. Now these are the interesting ones: array and the object. Here is the snippet for handling arrays. First, we check if object is an array by using the array.isArray function. If it is, we create a rest variable where we will accumulate all the results when we loop over the values of the array. Then here we have the loop. And lastly, we have the return value over here, which is just rest and all the values within it. Now let's talk about the body of this loop. For every value in the array, we append that to our rest variable by calling in stringify on that value. This is called recursion. We are calling the same function that we are creating, but we are passing in a smaller subset of the original input. In this case, just one single value in the array. Let's quickly see how this looks with our test 2 example. Let's say we are handling on converting the array value over here. When stringify is called here, we will end up in this if condition. Once we are in the loop, we will call stringify on 1, which is basically just the returning the string of this number. Similarly, for number 2, that's exactly what's going to happen as well. And then we have letter A here, which will then return a string but enclosed in double quotes. After the loop, since we are adding a comma at every single item here, we need to remember to remove that last comma. Then we just return the result. Recursion is a topic that really deserves its own video, but it's out of scope of this one, so I might make a video on that later on. Now let's work on the object case. Let me paste the block of code for this. In this one, we don't really need an if condition because it's the last case we have to handle. However, if you are not sure you're getting past the valid JSON object, then you definitely have to type check properly. So as you can see, this is very similar to our array case. The only difference is that we are looping through the object properties. Right here, Also, when we add to our result, we have to make sure to enclose the key in double quotes, followed by a colon, and then right after it is the call to the stringify and passing in the value that we have. Then we put a comma in the end. Again, we have to remove the last comma and also close our curly brackets in the result. After that, we just return result. And then that completes our stringify function. Let's walk through test case 1 in here. When this initially goes through our function, it will go skip all the top if conditions, and we will end up in the object logic. So we will go through the loop for A, that is our first key. We enclose that in double quotes. Then we call stringify on the value, which is right here, hello. So that means we are going to the top of this function and passing in just the string argument hello. As you see, we'll end up in the first condition and immediately return the string wrapped in double quotes. We repeat this process for every key value pair in the object, and then we remove the extra comma and we close the curly braces. So that's a sanity check that our stringify function is working. Now let's go over all of the test cases that we have here. As you can see, the goal here is that the string on the left, which is the call to our stringify function, looks exactly the same as the string on the right, which is the call to JSON.stringify, which is the built-in stringify function for JavaScript. All right, so what I'm gonna do is expand this and open up the console. So we can see it already started printing on the right side. And let's look at all of the test cases. First, test 1. You can see on the left looks exactly like that on the right. We can see that our simple cases here, like string being a value, is enclosed in double quotes. A number and a Boolean is not enclosed in double quotes. We also see that all properties or keys are enclosed in double quotes as well. So A, B, and C. Okay. For test 2, it's pretty much the same. However, here we added an array as a value and it's enclosed in brackets as expected. We also have an inner object and it's enclosed in curly braces as well. Moving on to test 3, we see that we have an array and the first item is just a string, but the second one is interesting because it's actually a reference to test 1. So it prints out whatever test 1 was as the second item. All right, and we see that both left and right looks exactly the same as well. Then we have our single values or just numbers and strings. So that's for test 4 and test 5, and they work as expected. So that's it. We've implemented the stringify function. Well, at least a simple version of it. So in this video, we learned about JSON, implementing JSON.stringify, and a little bit about recursion. Now, we didn't talk much about recursion, but let me know in the comments below if you would like to see a video on that. Meanwhile, I know you're feeling adventurous, so go ahead and try and implement JSON.parse on your own. You can use the same strategy that we used here. Again, thanks for watching the video. Hopefully, it's been helpful. And if you like the content, don't forget to like and subscribe. Till next time.